The footage didn't just go viral, it ignited a digital wildfire that scorched the carefully curated reputation of Montclair Heights. It was a grainy, high-definition drone shot, hovering like a mechanical voyeur over the historic conservatory's gala. One moment, the frame was a sea of black tuxedos and shimmering silk. The next, it was a chaotic blur of water. A woman in mud-caked work boots and heavy cargo pants, a ghost in the machinery of the elite, cut through the stagnant air. She dove with a terrifying, singular focus into the reflecting pool, her body a jagged line of defiance against the frozen guests. But the image that stopped the world's heart wasn't the splash. It was the aftermath. Thatcher Knox, the man who moved the city's invisible levers of power with a glance, was not standing over her in judgment. Instead, he had stripped his midnight blue jacket and dropped to his knees in the silt. There, amidst the ruined flower beds and the scent of expensive perfume, the most feared strategist on the East Coast knelt before the drenched maintenance girl. The hierarchy of the state didn't just bend, it broke. The king of Knox Urban Holdings was on the ground, and for the first time, he wasn't looking down on anyone. Before we continue, like this video if you've ever felt invisible in a world that only sees credentials and titles. Share it with someone who needs to hear that courage doesn't require permission. And subscribe, so you don't miss what happens when one temp worker sees the truth everyone else is paid to ignore. Now let's continue. Chapter 1. The air inside the historic botanical conservatory was thick, with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and the cloying sweetness of expensive champagne. Seraphine Vale adjusted the strap of her tool belt, the heavy leather biting into her hip through her dirt-stained cargo pants. To the politicians and real estate moguls circulating the room, she was just a part of the architecture, a utilitarian shadow moving along the perimeter to check the irrigation sensors. She preferred it that way. In the world of Montclair Heights, being noticed usually meant you were either being used or being judged, and Seraphine had spent enough time in the foster system to avoid both. She was tightening a valve near the secondary reflecting pool when she saw him. Bram Knox was a small, solitary figure in a sea of towering adults. He was dressed in a stiff, miniature tuxedo that seemed to swallow his slight frame, his dark hair falling into eyes that mirrored the restless intelligence of his father. While Thatcher Knox stood 10 feet away, locked in a low-frequency conversation with a state senator, the boy was inching toward the edge of the water, lured by the shimmering reflection of the overhead lanterns. Seraphine saw the danger before the security detail did. She knew this pool. She had cleaned its filters and mapped its depths. Most of it was decorative and shallow, but the center contained a concealed drop-off, a 4-foot plunge designed to house the complex pump system for the waterfalls. Bram reached for a floating lily pad, his polished shoe slipping on the moss-covered marble. There was no scream, only a sudden, sickening splash that cut through the polite hum of the gala like a gunshot. The reaction from the crowd was a study in paralysis. Security guards reached for their radios, frozen by the protocols of a high-profile event. Guests gasped, clutching their pearls and silk lapels, unwilling to ruin their $1,000 ensembles. But Seraphine didn't calculate. She didn't think about her tuition, her lack of an invitation, or the freezing temperature of the water. She hit the surface in a flat, powerful dive, her work boots heavy as lead as she kicked toward the center. Beneath the surface, the water was a murky green, lit only by the distorted glow of the gala lights. She saw the boy sinking, his small hands clawing at the emptiness of the deep-end shaft. Seraphine lunged, her fingers tangling in the fabric of his jacket. With a desperate heave, she kicked off the bottom, her lungs burning as she breached the surface. The silence that met her was absolute. She hauled Bram onto the marble ledge, his small chest heaving as he coughed up lungfuls of chlorinated water. Seraphine climbed out behind him, her bronze skin slick and shivering, her natural coils dripping onto the pristine floor. Then, the sea of tuxedos parted. Thatcher Knox moved with a predatory, terrifying speed. The cold strategist, the man whose hands were rumored to never fidget, looked at his son with a raw, jagged terror. But it was what happened next that shattered the room's collective sense of reality. Thatcher didn't call for a medic. He didn't yell at his security team. He looked at Seraphine, drenched, mud-stained and breathing hard, and he stripped off his midnight blue blazer. Without a word, the most powerful man in the state dropped to his knees in the mud and water at her feet. He ignored the ruin of his tailored trousers, his gray eyes locking onto hers, with a focus so intense it felt like a physical weight. "You didn't just save my son," Thatcher said, his voice a low, vibrating chord that carried to the furthest corner of the room. "You saved my world." He didn't reach for Bram first. He reached for Seraphine's hand, his palms rough and warm against her cold skin. In that moment, the hierarchy of Montclair Heights collapsed. The dawn had knelt before the groundskeeper, and as the cameras of 100 smartphones flashed in the shadows, Seraphine realized that by saving the boy, she had inadvertently set fire to the world she had worked so hard to stay hidden from. She didn't bow, she simply nodded, her hazel eyes steady, as she looked into the face of the man who was about to change everything. Chapter 2. The morning after the gala, the world Seraphine Vale had carefully constructed out of textbooks and maintenance shifts was gone, replaced by a reality that moved with the cold, silent efficiency of a Knox Urban Holdings boardroom. She sat in the dean's office of her university, her hazel eyes fixed on the man across from her. He wasn't the dean. He was a legal representative for Thatcher Knox, a man whose suit looked like it had been carved from the same midnight blue granite as his boss's reputation. "Your tuition for the remainder of your graduate program has been settled in full, Ms. Vale," the lawyer said, sliding a thick folder across the mahogany desk. "As has your outstanding student debt. You are no longer an employee of the conservatory's grounds crew." Seraphine didn't reach for the folder. She kept her hands folded in her lap, her expression as unreadable as a limestone cliff. "I didn't ask for a payout. I saved a child because he was drowning. That's not a transaction." "Mr. Knox doesn't do transactions," a new voice interrupted. Thatcher Knox stepped into the office, his presence immediately shrinking the room. He wasn't wearing a suit today. He was in a dark charcoal sweater and tailored trousers, yet he looked more dangerous than he had in formal wear. "He does investments. And right now, the most valuable asset in my world is the woman who pulled my son from a trap my own security failed to see." He signaled the lawyer to leave, and when the door clicked shut, Thatcher leaned against the desk, his ice-gray eyes searching hers. "The viral footage from last night has made you a target, Seraphine. My enemies, men who would use a pebble to crack a mountain, now see you as a way to get to me. They think you're my weakness, because you did what they never would. You showed mercy. I'm a graduate student, Mr. Knox. I don't belong in your wars," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline humming in her veins. "Which is why you are officially accepting a senior internship at Knox Urban Holdings," Thatcher countered. "Under the guise of environmental engineering consultancy for our New York waterfront project. You will have a salary, a title, and most importantly, you will live in a secure residence provided by the firm. My security detail will be your shadows. You won't be a guest, you will be a consultant, but in reality, you will be under my protection." He held out a set of keys and a sleek, encrypted smartphone. The safe house was a term he used lightly, but Seraphine knew what it meant, a gilded cage. Yet, as she looked at the photos Thatcher pulled up on the phone, images of Bram sitting silently in a high-walled estate, looking more fragile than ever, she felt the hook snag in her heart. "Bram hasn't spoken to anyone since last night," Thatcher said, his voice dropping to a lower, more vulnerable register. "Except to ask if the lady from the water was coming back. You're the only person who acts without calculating the cost, Seraphine. My world is full of accountants. My son needs an engineer." Seraphine looked at the keys. She knew that by taking them, she was crossing a line she could never uncross. She was leaving the safety of her invisibility for the blinding glare of the Knox Empire. But she thought of the boy's terrified eyes beneath the water, and the way Thatcher had knelt in the mud, a man of absolute power surrendering his pride to a stranger. "I'll take the internship," she said, standing up and meeting his gaze with a defiance that made Thatcher's stillness flicker for the first time. "But I don't work for your syndicate, and I don't bow to your reputation. I'm doing this for Bram, and the moment the threat is gone, I'm back to my gardens." Thatcher watched her pick up the keys. A ghost of a smile, cold and appreciative, touched his lips. "The threat is never truly gone, Ms. Vale. But for now, welcome to the firm." As she walked out of the office and into the waiting black SUV, Seraphine realized that while she had saved Bram from the reflecting pool, she had just dived into an ocean far deeper, and Thatcher Knox was the only one who knew where the drop-off was. Chapter 3. The safe house was a masterpiece of cold, contemporary geometry, a fortress of glass and steel perched on the highest ridge of Montclair Heights. It was a place designed for observation and defense, not for living. Seraphine stood in the center of the atrium, her boots feeling loud and intrusive against the polished white marble. She had been here for 3 days, officially a senior intern, with a security badge and a high-spec laptop, but her real work was currently sitting on a velvet sofa in the library, staring at a dead television screen. Bram Knox hadn't spoken since the rescue. He was a small island of silence in a house, buzzing with the low-frequency chatter of Thatcher's security detail. The boy looked smaller than he had at the gala, his slight frame draped in oversized designer loungewear, his eyes fixed on nothing. Thatcher's world was one of absolute control. Yet as Seraphine watched the boy, she saw the one thing no amount of money or security could fix, a crushing, sterile loneliness. "He won't eat the fruit," one of the household staff whispered as they passed her with a pristine silver tray. "Mr. Knox says it's the shock. He needs time." Seraphine looked at the tray of perfectly sliced imported mangoes and dragon fruit. It was too perfect, too detached from the earth. She thought of the soil beneath the conservatory, the grit under her fingernails, and the way things actually grew. She didn't ask for permission. She walked into the kitchen, grabbed a bag of raw, unwashed heirloom carrots from the walk-in cooler, stalks and dirt still attached, and headed for the library. She didn't announce herself. She simply sat on the floor across from Bram, pulled a small pocket knife from her cargo pants, and began to scrape the dirt off a carrot. The sound was rhythmic and grounding. Bram's eyes flickered, shifting from the blank screen to her hands. "The reflecting pool wasn't just a pond, Bram," she said, her voice low and steady, not looking up from her task. "It was a machine. But out here, in the real dirt, things don't need pumps to survive. They just need the right kind of light and a little bit of struggle." She held out a carrot, the orange skin vibrant and imperfect. Bram hesitated, his small hand reaching out slowly. He took it, his thumb brushing over a tiny knot in the root. For the first time, a spark of curiosity cut through the fog in his eyes. "Why is it hairy?" he whispered. His voice was thin, like paper tearing. "Those are root hairs," Seraphine explained, leaning back against a bookshelf. "They're reaching for water. They're fighters. In your father's world, everything is paved over so you never see the struggle. But the real world, the one I work in, is messy. It's loud. And it's alive." She spent the next hour ignoring the security cameras and the looming shadow of Thatcher, who she knew was watching from the mezzanine. She didn't talk to Bram like he was a fragile heir or a victim. She talked to him like an apprentice. She told him about the secret life of the conservatory, how the plants communicated through fungal networks in the soil, and how the drop-off in the pool wasn't a mistake of nature, but a design of men. "You're an engineer," Bram said, taking a small, tentative bite of the carrot. The crunch echoed in the silent room. "I am," Seraphine said. "And engineers don't just build things, Bram. We understand how they break. So if you're scared of the water, it's because you don't understand the mechanics of it yet. Once you know how it works, it can't surprise you anymore." Bram looked at her, and for the first time he didn't look like a boy waiting for a monster to jump out of the shadows. He looked like a boy who had just been handed a map. In the doorway above, Thatcher Knox stood in the darkness, his hands gripped tightly over the railing. He had spent millions trying to build a world that would keep his son safe, but it had taken a woman with dirt on her hands and a raw carrot to bring him back from the depths. Seraphine wasn't just teaching Bram about botany, she was teaching him about resilience, the one thing Thatcher's empire couldn't manufacture. As Bram reached for another carrot, he looked at Seraphine and asked the first real question of his new life. "Can we go outside? To the real dirt?" Seraphine smiled, a flash of hazel warmth. "The real dirt is where everything starts, Bram. Let's go." Chapter 4. The glass-walled office provided to Seraphine at Knox Urban Holdings felt less like a workspace, and more like a laboratory for a life she was still deciphering. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the skyline of New Jersey was a jagged heartbeat of steel and light, but Seraphine's focus was downward, buried in the digital layers of the conservatory's architectural history. She had spent the last 6 hours cross-referencing the original municipal permits with the updated CAD files for the reflecting pool, and something in the geometry felt fundamentally wrong. In the world of environmental engineering, water follows the path of least resistance, but in the world of Thatcher Knox, even the water seemed to be working under a contract. Seraphine rubbed her eyes, her hazel gaze sharp with a growing cold suspicion. She leaned back in her ergonomic chair, a piece of furniture that cost more than her car, and pulled up the high-resolution scan of the pool's hydraulic system. The drop-off that had nearly claimed Bram's life was labeled in the original 1920s blueprints as a maintenance shaft for the decorative fountains. It was supposed to be capped with a reinforced steel grate, fixed in place by 4 heavy-duty industrial bolts. When she had dived in, she hadn't felt a grate. She had felt a void. "You're working late, Ms. Vale. Most of my senior analysts are already halfway to their second martini by now." Seraphine didn't flinch. She had grown accustomed to Thatcher's silent, predatory habit of appearing without a sound. He stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the hallway lights, looking every bit the strategist who saw 3 moves ahead of everyone else. "I don't drink martinis, Mr. Knox," she said, her voice steady as she tapped a key on her keyboard to highlight a section of the blueprint in glowing red. "And I don't stop until the math makes sense. Right now your math is broken." Thatcher walked toward her desk, his eyes scanning the monitors. The investigation by the private security firm concluded it was a failure of the aged concrete. "Structural fatigue. Structural fatigue doesn't unscrew 4-inch galvanized steel bolts," Seraphine countered, her natural coils shifting as she shook her head. She zoomed in on a detail of the current maintenance log. "Look at the pressure sensor readings from the morning of the gala. There was a localized spike in the hydraulic flow at 4 p.m. That's not a leak. That's someone manually overriding the overflow valves to create a suction effect near the shaft. Thatcher's posture shifted. It wasn't a large movement, but the air in the room suddenly felt thinner, colder. He leaned over the desk, his ice-gray eyes narrowing as he stared at the data. The grate was removed, he whispered, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't an accident, Thatcher, Seraphine said, using his first name for the first time without realizing it. She stood up, her tall, lean frame meeting his gaze with a terrifyingly calm sincerity. Someone knew Bram would be near that water. Someone knew the security detail would be focused on the perimeter, and not the center. They didn't just let him fall. They built a trap that utilized the physics of the pool to ensure he wouldn't come back up. Thatcher's hands, usually so still they looked carved from marble, gripped the edge of the mahogany desk until his knuckles turned white. The revelation was a jagged blade, in the heart of his control. He had built an empire to protect his son, only to realize the monster had been inside the blueprints all along. Who had access to these files? Seraphine asked, her environmental engineering background now serving as a forensic tool. The override required a level 4 security clearance on the conservatory's integrated building management system. Thatcher didn't answer immediately. He turned away, looking out at the city he supposedly controlled. Only 3 people in my conglomerate have that clearance, he said, his voice a low, vibrating growl of suppressed fury. Men I have trusted for a decade. Men who have sat at my table. Then your table is compromised, Seraphine said plainly. She walked around the desk, stopping just behind him. You've been looking for a political enemy, but this isn't politics. This is engineering. This was a clinical, calculated removal of an obstacle. To whoever did this, Bram wasn't a boy. He was a variable they wanted to delete. Thatcher turned back to her, and for the first time the dawn was gone. In his eyes was the raw, bleeding terror of a father who realized he had invited the predator into his home. He looked at Seraphine, at the woman in the cargo pants who had seen the truth that a dozen high-priced security experts had missed. I brought you here to protect you, Seraphine, Thatcher said, his voice cracking slightly. But it seems you're the only one truly protecting us. He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder before he pulled it back, as if afraid his world of shadows would stain her. I need you to dig deeper. I want to know who authorized the last maintenance check on that pool. I want every log, every email, every hidden line of code. I'm already on it, Seraphine replied, her hazel eyes reflecting the red glow of the sabotaged blueprints. But Thatcher, once I find out who it is, you can't just delete them like a bad line of code. You have to understand why they did it. Because if someone is willing to drown an 8-year-old boy, they aren't going to stop until the whole empire is underwater. Thatcher nodded, the strategist returning to his eyes but with a new, lethal edge. They won't get the chance. You found the flaw in the design, Seraphine. Now, help me find the hand that drew it. As she sat back down and the keyboard began to click once more, the invisible groundskeeper realized she was no longer just an observer of the Nox world. She was the one holding the flashlight in the dark, and the shadows were beginning to scream. Chapter 5. The conference room on the 64th floor was a sterile cathedral of chrome and tempered glass, smelling of expensive air filtration and the metallic tang of high-end electronics. Seraphine felt the weight of her work boots on the plush executive carpet, a soundless but heavy intrusion into a space where every other footfall was muffled by Italian leather. She was still wearing her cargo pants and a fitted black tee, her natural coils pulled back in a tight, practical knot. Beside her, Thatcher Knox moved with the effortless grace of a man who owned the air everyone else was breathing. The heavy oak doors swung open to reveal the Wolf's boardroom. 12 men and 3 women sat around a table that looked like a single slab of polished obsidian. These were the architects of Thatcher's invisible empire, heads of logistics, private security, and real estate development. As they entered, the low hum of conversation died instantly. All eyes landed on Seraphine, and the air grew thick with a condescending, clinical curiosity. Everyone, sit, Thatcher commanded. He didn't go to the head of the table. Instead, he pulled out a chair for Seraphine in the center of the room, forcing the executives to turn their bodies to face her. This is Seraphine Vale. She is the senior environmental consultant for the waterfront project. She is also the person who found the flaw in the conservatory's hydraulic security. A man at the far end of the table, whose silver hair was as sharp as his silk tie, let out a soft, dismissive chuckle. This was Julian Vane, the chief of operations, and a man who had been with the Knox family for 20 years. With all due respect, Thatcher, Vane said, his voice dripping with practiced diplomacy, the girl is a groundskeeper. We have a Tier 1 security firm and a team of forensic architects who have already cleared the site. Bringing an intern into a high-level strategic briefing on internal sabotage seems like a lapse in judgment. Seraphine didn't wait for Thatcher to defend her. She leaned forward, placing her calloused hands flat on the obsidian table. She didn't look at Thatcher. She looked directly at Vane. The Tier 1 security firm you're so proud of missed a localized pressure spike in the overflow valves because they were looking for a physical breach, Seraphine said, her voice calm, projecting a steady hazel fire. They were looking for a broken lock. I was looking at the fluid dynamics, while your forensic architects were busy checking the concrete for cracks. They ignored the fact that the building management system was programmed to create a vacuum. You didn't have a structural failure, Mr. Vane. You had a weaponized plumbing system. She pulled a tablet from her bag and swiped a finger, casting a complex flowchart onto the massive wall-mounted screens. The diagram showed the intersection of the conservatory's water lines and the digital override protocols. The logic gates were altered at 3:14 p.m. on the day of the gala, she continued, her environmental engineering background acting as a scalpel. Anyone with a basic understanding of sensor calibration could see it. The fact that your experts cleared the site suggests they are either incompetent or they were told exactly what not to look for. The room went cold. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was a vacuum. Vane's face flushed a deep violent red, his composure fraying at the edges. You're suggesting internal collusion based on a sensor reading? You have no idea how this syndicate operates, little girl. I know how machines operate, Seraphine countered, standing up. She didn't raise her voice, but it carried a weight that made the executives at the back of the room sit up straighter. Machines don't lie to cover their tracks. They don't have egos, and they don't have better offers from rival conglomerates. I don't care about your hierarchy, or your history. I care about the fact that an 8-year-old boy was targeted using a system this board is responsible for. If you find my presence an insult to your status, imagine how much of an insult it will be when I find the digital signature of the person who authorized that override. Thatcher Knox watched her, his ice-gray eyes unreadable, but a muscle in his jaw flexed with a dark, satisfied pride. He saw the way she didn't flinch under the collective weight of their stares. She was a woman who had survived the foster system and the grit of maintenance shifts. A boardroom full of men in suits was nothing compared to a winter storm in a broken greenhouse. Ms. Vale stays, Thatcher said, his voice a finality that brooked no argument. She will have full access to the server logs. Anyone who denies her entry or fails to provide the data she requests will be answering to me personally. Julian, you will provide her with the maintenance rosters for the last quarter by the end of the hour. Vane gritted his teeth, nodding once. A curt, jerky movement. The power in the room had shifted. It was no longer a meeting of strategists. It was a hunt, and the invisible girl had just been handed the lead. As the meeting broke up and the executives hurried out, avoiding Seraphine's gaze, Thatcher walked over to her. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. They're afraid of you, he noted quietly. Good, Seraphine replied, packing her tablet. Fear makes people sloppy, and whoever did this was very, very careful. I want them to start sweating. Thatcher looked at the screen, where the red lines of the sabotaged system still glowed. You realize that by standing up to them, you've put yourself in the middle of the crosshairs? Seraphine adjusted her tool belt, the leather creaking in the silent room. I've been in the crosshairs my whole life, Thatcher. The only difference is, this time, I'm the one looking through the scope. Chapter 6. The transformation of Seraphine Vale was not a matter of makeup or silk, but a tactical recalibration. Standing before the full-length mirror in the Knox estate, she looked at the woman staring back, a figure draped in a floor-length, deep emerald gown that shimmered like a forest. After a storm, the fabric was a second skin, cut to emphasize her lean, swimmer's build and the sharp, defined lines of her bronze shoulders. Her natural coils had been sculpted into an elegant, high-swept crown, secured with pins of black diamond that caught the light like trapped stars. She looked like a queen, yet as she reached down to strap a small, pressurized sensor tester to her inner thigh beneath the slit of the dress, it was clear she was still the maintenance girl. The dress is armored with a lightweight Kevlar weave. Thatcher's voice drifted from the doorway. He was in a tuxedo that made him look less like a CEO and more like a weapon sheathed in wool. He stepped into the light, his ice-gray eyes sweeping over her with a flicker of something that wasn't entirely professional. But I suspect you're more interested in the hidden pockets I had the tailor add for your multi-tool. Beauty is a distraction, Thatcher, Seraphine said, adjusting the emerald fabric. Function is what keeps people alive. If we're going back into the lion's den, this time at the Metropolitan Museum's gala, I'm not going as a trophy. I'm going as the person who checks the locks. The second gala was a far grander affair than the first, a concentrated gathering of the East Coast's true architecture of power. As they stepped out of the black armored sedan, the flashbulbs of the paparazzi created a strobe light effect against the museum's limestone pillars. Thatcher didn't offer her his arm as a gesture of chivalry, he offered it as a statement of partnership. When they entered the Great Hall, the hum of conversation didn't just dip, it curdled. The angel of the conservatory was no longer in work boots, and the sight of her standing beside the King of Shadows in a dress that cost more than a graduate degree was a provocation to every person who believed the hierarchy was fixed. Throughout the night, Seraphine moved through the room with a predatory grace. While the wives of real estate tycoons tried to engage her in vapid talk about seasonal charities, Seraphine's hazel eyes were constantly scanning the ceiling heights, the vent placements, and the secondary exits. She ignored the champagne, opting for mineral water as she mentally mapped the museum's integrated building management system. She wasn't looking for friends. She was looking for the person who had sweated through the boardroom meeting 3 days ago. Ms. Vale. A voice croaked behind her. It was Julian Vane, holding a martini and looking far less composed than he had in the office. You look different tonight. I suppose the Knox check cleared. Seraphine turned, her emerald gown catching the light. She didn't smile. The check cleared, Julian. But I'm still the girl who knows how to find a leak in a pressurized system. Speaking of which, I noticed the HVAC logs for this wing were rerouted through a private server an hour ago. You wouldn't happen to know why the chief of operations would be interested in the air filtration protocols during a party, would you? Vane's hand trembled slightly, the gin sloshing against the glass. He opened his mouth to retort, but Seraphine had already turned away, her focus caught by a subtle flicker in the overhead LED array. She didn't see the gala as a party. She saw it as a massive complex engine, and she could hear a knocking in the cylinders. She caught Thatcher's eye across the room. He was surrounded by senators, but his gaze was locked on her. She gave a single, sharp nod toward the north wing, the area housing the museum's central control hub. She wasn't there to be the maintenance girl anymore. She was the architect of the counter-trap. As she drifted toward the shadows of the Egyptian wing, her emerald train whispering against the stone floor, Seraphine realized that the best way to catch a wolf was to look like the moon, and tonight, she was glowing with a dangerous, calculated light. Chapter 7. The Metropolitan Museum's Egyptian wing was a sanctuary of sandstone and silence, but to Seraphine, it felt like a pressurized chamber nearing its burst point. The air was too still, the shadows between the monolithic statues of the pharaohs too deep. While the elite of the city toasted to their own longevity in the Great Hall, Seraphine stood near a floor-to-ceiling glass wall overlooking the dark expanse of Central Park. She wasn't looking at the skyline. She was looking at the reflection of the internal light sensors in the glass. Thatcher Knox approached her, his presence heralded by the faint scent of cedar and the cold authority that never left him. He stood beside her, looking out at the blackness of the park. The security team has cleared the perimeter, Seraphine. You can stop looking for ghosts for 10 minutes. I'm not looking for ghosts, Thatcher. I'm looking for line of sight, she said, her voice a low, urgent hum. She didn't turn to him. She was focused on a tiny rhythmic flicker in a stand of trees 500 yards away. It was a rhythmic pulse, not a bird, not the wind, but the glint of coated glass. The north wing is higher than the surrounding gallery. From that knoll in the park, someone has a clear path through this glass. And the gala's internal lighting is currently at 80% brightness. We're standing in a light box. Thatcher's posture didn't change. His discipline was absolute, but his gray eyes tracked her gaze. My men have the terrace covered. They have the terrace covered from a ground-level breach, she countered, her mind racing through the museum's lighting schematics she had memorized. They aren't looking at the elevation, and the HVAC system just shifted. The air pressure in this wing is dropping. Someone is manipulating the building's environmental controls to create a vacuum seal on the windows. It keeps the glass from vibrating when a bullet passes through. As if on cue, the tiny glint in the trees stilled. Seraphine didn't have a weapon, and Thatcher's security was 30 seconds too far away. She had only the tools of a maintenance girl, the knowledge of the wires and the light. She reached beneath the slit of her emerald gown, her fingers finding the small, pressurized sensor tester she had strapped to her thigh. It wasn't a weapon, but it carried a high-frequency override signal designed to test emergency lighting circuits. She pointed it at the ceiling's infrared receiver, the brain of the wing's smart glass and lighting array. Down, she hissed, grabbing Thatcher's silk lapel and throwing her weight into him. As they hit the stone floor, Seraphine triggered the tester. The signal didn't just turn off the lights. It forced a high-voltage surge into the museum's automated blackout shades. In a jagged mechanical scream, the massive heavy-duty shutters slammed shut, and the gallery's internal lights strobed into a blinding, disorienting whiteout, a maintenance test mode designed to check for dead bulbs. A split second later, a sharp crack echoed through the wing. It wasn't the sound of a gunshot, but the sound of high-velocity lead shattering against the newly lowered armored shutters. The bullet, intended for Thatcher's head, was buried in 3 inches of reinforced steel. The room erupted. Security teams flooded the wing, their black tactical gear a stark contrast to the ancient stone. Thatcher was on top of her, his body shielding hers, his breathing the only sound in the sudden, vibrating silence of the blackout. "You're insane," Thatcher rasped, his face inches from hers. The ice in his eyes had melted into something raw and unrecognizable. "I'm an engineer," Seraphine replied, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I know how to blow a fuse. And I told you." The math didn't add up. He helped her up, his grip on her arm lingering, fierce and protective. The emerald gown was dusty, the diamond pins in her hair askew, but as the security team began their frantic sweep of the park, Thatcher didn't look at the threat. He looked at Seraphine. She had thwarted a professional hit with a maintenance tool and a lighting glitch. In the shadows of the Egyptian wing, the Don realized that while he had the guns, he was standing next to the only person who understood the electricity that moved the world. Chapter 8. The adrenaline that had sustained Seraphine through the museum's blackout had ebbed away, leaving a hollow, aching exhaustion that settled deep in her bones. They were back at the Montclair estate, the massive glass fortress, now bathed in the silver-blue glow of security floods. Bram had long since been tucked into bed by his personal detail, leaving Thatcher and Seraphine alone in the expansive glass conservatory at the rear of the property. It was the only room in the house where Seraphine felt she could breathe, a controlled ecosystem of tropical ferns and humid air that smelled of life instead of cold, sterile power. Thatcher stood by a towering traveler's palm, his tuxedo jacket discarded, and his white shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked at his hands, those still, broad hands that moved empires, and for the first time, Seraphine saw them tremble. He didn't look like a strategist or a don. He looked like a man who had just watched his anchor slip into the deep. "You should be in bed," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to harmonize with the rhythmic hum of the greenhouse's climate control. "The security team is pulling the ballistics from the shutter. You've done enough for one night." "I don't go to sleep when the machine is still knocking, Thatcher," Seraphine replied. She was sitting on a stone planter, her emerald gown pooled around her like spilled ink. She began to unpin the black diamonds from her hair, dropping them into her palm like common pebbles. "You told me once that you brought me here to protect me, but we both know you brought me here because I'm the only person in your life who isn't on the payroll." "Why?" Thatcher turned to face her. The moon caught the sharp angles of his face, highlighting the ice gray of his eyes which were now clouded with a heavy, ancient weight. "You think I was born into this," he said, gesturing to the sprawling estate. "You see the suits, the logistics firms, the way people move when I enter a room, and you assume it's an inheritance. A family legacy of shadows." He stepped closer, the light from a nearby lunar lamp casting a long shadow between them. "I was 6 when my parents were deported. I was left on a sidewalk in Queens, with nothing but a backpack, and a name I couldn't even spell yet. I spent 12 years in the New York foster system, Seraphine. 6 different homes. 3 different names. I learned very early that the only way to survive a system designed to forget you is to become the architect of your own world." Seraphine froze, a diamond pin halfway to her palm. She looked at the man she had called a monster, a strategist, and a king, and she saw the mirror image of her own jagged history. The foster system wasn't just a background, it was a blueprint. It taught you to read a room for exits, to never trust a promise, and to understand that power was the only thing that kept the lights on. "I grew up in the same darkness," she whispered, her hazel eyes softening. "I stayed in the system until I was 18. That's why I work with the earth, Thatcher. Plants don't care about your paperwork or your bloodline. If you feed them, they grow. They're honest." "I chose a different kind of honesty," Thatcher said, leaning against a support beam. "I chose the honesty of leverage. I built Knox Urban Holdings because I wanted to own the ground I stood on, so no one could ever kick me off it again. I built the security firms because I wanted to be the one who decided who was safe. But I forgot one thing." "You forgot that you can't build a fortress thick enough to keep out the ghosts," Seraphine said. "I forgot that the more you own, the more you have to lose," he admitted, his voice cracking. He looked toward the house, toward the room where Bram slept. "Bram isn't just my son. He's the only part of me that isn't a calculation. When you dove into that water, you didn't just save a boy. You saved the only proof I have that I'm still human." He walked over to her, his hand reaching out to touch her cheek, but he stopped an inch away, as if afraid the oil and grit of his life would ruin the purity of hers. "We're the same, Seraphine. We're survivors who decided to build something. You build gardens. I build empires. But tonight, for the first time in 20 years, I felt like that 6-year-old on the sidewalk again. Helpless." Seraphine reached up, closing the distance, and placed her hand over his. His skin was warm, his pulse steady but fast. "You're not on that sidewalk anymore, Thatcher. And you're not alone. I didn't save Bram because of your empire. I saved him because I knew exactly what it felt like to be a child waiting for someone, anyone, to jump in." In the humid silence of the conservatory, the hierarchy finally dissolved. There was no Don, no groundskeeper, no billionaire, and no intern. There were only 2 people who had emerged from the same fire, looking at each other through the smoke. Thatcher's hand finally settled against her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with a reverence that no amount of money could buy. The hidden truth wasn't that they were different, it was that they were the only two people in Montclair Heights who truly understood what it cost to stay alive. Chapter 9. The air in Montclair Heights had grown brittle, a precursor to the storm that had been gathering since Seraphine first disturbed the surface of the reflecting pool. Thatcher's world was no longer just a collection of logistics firms and real estate deeds. It was a siege map, and the lines were being redrawn by a hand that wielded political immunity like a blade. Senator Silas Sterling, a man whose public image was built on the renewal of the New Jersey waterfront, had finally stopped whispering. He had moved into the light, launching a coordinated hostile takeover of Knox Urban Holdings that began not with a stock buyback but with a legislative strike. It started at 8 a.m. with a flurry of freezing orders on Knox's primary construction accounts, citing environmental irregularities that Seraphine knew were manufactured. By noon, the senator's private equity partners had triggered a clause in the waterfront development contract that allowed for a forced transition of management if the CEO was deemed a security risk. The sniper in the park hadn't just been an assassin, he had been a pretext. By making Thatcher look like a target of unstable violence, Sterling was painting him as an unfit steward of the city's future. Seraphine was in the secure data hub of the estate, her fingers flying across the keys as she tracked the digital trail of the frozen assets. "He's not just taking the company, Thatcher," she said, her voice tight with the cold clarity of a forensic engineer. "He's hollowed out the foundations. These environmental citations, they're signed by the same subcontractors who maintained the conservatory pool. Sterling didn't just sabotage the water, he's been sabotaging your entire supply chain for years." Thatcher stood behind her, his midnight blue suit pristine, but his face a mask of restrained lethal focus. "He wants the waterfront project because it's the gateway to the Atlantic corridor. He's used my infrastructure to build his own shadow network, and now he's trying to evict me from my own house." But the financial strike was only a distraction. The true move came when the estate's secondary perimeter alarm, the one Seraphine had recalibrated to detect changes in underground seismic vibrations, began to hum. "Thatcher," Seraphine breathed, her eyes widening as she looked at the monitor. "The front gate is a decoy. They're coming through the old maintenance tunnels, the ones that connect to the municipal water main." Sterling wasn't interested in a boardroom vote. He wanted the leverage that only one thing could provide. Bram. The boy was in the upper sunroom, completing a botanical drawing of a root system Seraphine had shown him that morning. Before Thatcher could even reach for his radio, the glass of the conservatory shattered, not from a bullet, but from a calculated explosive charge that blew the heavy reinforced doors off their hinges. "Get to Bram!" Thatcher roared, drawing his weapon and moving toward the atrium to intercept the tactical team flooding in from the tunnels. Seraphine didn't hesitate. She knew the layout of the house better than the security detail, because she had studied the vents and the pipes. She ran, not toward the stairs, but toward the service lift. She reached the sunroom just as a man in a gray tactical vest, devoid of any insignia, lunged for the boy. Bram didn't scream. He had learned the stillness of his father. He ducked under a glass table, his eyes wide as he looked for the one person he trusted. "Bram, to me!" Seraphine shouted. She didn't have a gun, but she had a heavy brass irrigation wrench she had kept in her cargo pants. As the intruder grabbed for Bram's arm, Seraphine swung. The metal connected with the man's temple with a sickening thud, sending him sprawling across the tile. She scooped the boy up, her lean muscles straining. "Stay low, don't look back," she whispered into his ear. She didn't head for the main hall, where the gunfire was now echoing like a hailstorm. She headed for the mechanical room. The senator had moved his pieces, thinking Thatcher Knox was a man who only understood power, and that Seraphine was just a girl who understood dirt. He was wrong. Seraphine understood how to make a building work for her, and how to make it a trap for anyone else. As she locked the heavy steel door of the boiler room and pulled Bram into the shadows of the massive copper pipes, she realized the hostile takeover was no longer about money. It was about survival. And in the dark, beneath the roar of the machinery, the maintenance girl was the one who held the keys to the kingdom. Chapter 10. The skeleton of the Sterling Knox waterfront tower groaned under the lash of a gale-force wind, a spire of raw steel and jagged ambition clawing at the midnight sky. Below, the city of Jersey City was a blurred tapestry of amber lights, but up here, on the 64th floor, there was only the whistle of the abyss and the scent of ozone. Senator Silas Sterling stood on the edge of the unpolished concrete slab, his silhouette framed by the massive mechanical crane that loomed like a gallows. He wasn't alone. Thatcher Knox was on his knees, his midnight blue suit torn, a thin trail of blood tracing the line of his jaw. Behind him, two of Sterling's private contractors held suppressed rifles to the base of his skull. The problem with architects, Thatcher, is that they think the foundation is the most important part of the building, Sterling said, his voice barely a whisper against the wind. But in politics, it's the height. From here, I can see every piece of land I'm going to take from you. And once you're gone, the quote, environmental tragedy of this site's collapse will be the final nail in your legacy. Thatcher didn't look at the rifles. His ice-gray eyes were fixed on the shadows near the central elevator shaft. He knew she was there. He could feel the shift in the air pressure, the subtle vibration in the steel that only an engineer, or someone who loved one, would notice. Seraphine moved through the darkness of the utility core with the silent precision of a predator in her own habitat. She had bypassed the primary elevators and climbed the internal crane ladder, her work boots gripping the rungs with a familiarity that bypassed fear. She wasn't just a girl in the shadows anymore. She was the ghost in the machine. In her hand she clutched the high-frequency bypass tool she had built in the estate's lab, a device designed to talk to the building's nervous system. "You're wrong, Senator," Thatcher rasped, a cold, jagged smile touching his lips. "The most important part of a building isn't the height, it's failsafe." At that moment, Seraphine slammed the bypass tool into the exposed junction box of the floor's temporary electrical grid. She didn't just cut the lights. She triggered the emergency fire suppression sequence for the entire floor. In a sudden, violent roar, the massive industrial fans designed to vent smoke reversed their intake. The pressure in the open-air floor shifted instantly, creating a localized wind tunnel that caught the senator and his men off balance. As the contractor stumbled, shielded by the sudden whiteout of dust and debris, Seraphine lunged from the shadows. She didn't go for the men with guns. She dove for the crane's remote operator console. With a sharp, practiced twist of the override key, she swung the massive 5-ton counterweight of the crane. The steel arm swept across the floor with a terrifying, low-pitched hum, knocking the rifles from the contractor's hands and pinning them against the structural columns. "Thatcher, move!" Seraphine screamed. Thatcher didn't need to be told twice. He surged forward, tackling Sterling, just as the senator reached for a concealed sidearm. The two men crashed into the safety netting at the edge of the abyss, but the net was never meant to hold the weight of a desperate man's ambition. The mounting bolts, already compromised by the irregularities Seraphine had uncovered in the blueprints, began to scream as they tore from the concrete. Thatcher was slipping, his boots scrabbling for purchase on the wet concrete, his hand gripped around Sterling's collar. The senator was dead weight, his eyes wide, with the sudden realization that the void didn't care about his title. Seraphine didn't hesitate. She threw herself onto the concrete, anchoring her heels against a reinforced rebar nub and reaching out into the darkness. Her bronze arm, corded with the muscle of 1,000 maintenance shifts, locked around Thatcher's wrist. "I've got you," she roared over the wind. For a heartbeat, the three of them hung over the edge of the world, a senator, a Don, and a maintenance girl. The physics were simple. The rebar wouldn't hold all of them. Thatcher looked at Seraphine, his gray eyes filled with a raw, agonizing love. He began to loosen his grip on Sterling, prepared to let the senator fall to save the woman holding him. "No!" Seraphine gritted her teeth, her hazel eyes blazing with a fierce, unbreakable integrity. "Nobody else dies for this empire, Thatcher. Not even him." With a strength born of a lifetime of carrying her own weight, she used the crane's hoist cable, which she had looped around her free arm, as a pulley. She heaved. The steel cable sang as it took the tension, and with a final, gut-wrenching pull, she hauled both men back onto the solid ground of the 64th floor. Sterling collapsed, gasping and broken, as Thatcher's security detail, led by the now loyal remnants of the board, finally breached the stairwell. But Thatcher didn't look at the senator. He didn't look at the victory. He crawled to Seraphine, who was slumped against the crane console, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her hands slick with the oil of the machine that had saved them. He pulled her into him, his face buried in her neck, his body shaking with a terror that no bullet had ever caused. "You saved me," he whispered, the words lost to the wind for everyone but her. "You saved me twice." Seraphine leaned her head against his shoulder, looking out at the horizon, where the first hint of dawn was beginning to touch the red mesas of the distant horizon. "I told you, Thatcher," she said, her voice finally finding its calm. "I know how things are built, and I know how to make sure they don't fall." As the sun rose over the waterfront tower, the summit of shadows was over. The senator was in handcuffs, the syndicate was in ruins, but standing on the highest point in the city, the architect and the gardener were finally standing on a foundation that couldn't be sabotaged. Chapter 11. The reconstruction of Knox Urban Holdings did not begin with a press release or a flurry of stock trades, but with the literal removal of the tinted glass that had shielded the boardroom from the world. In the weeks following the standoff at the waterfront tower, the King of Shadows made a choice that sent shockwaves through the gated communities of Montclair Heights and the concrete canyons of Jersey City. Thatcher Knox, a man who had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of the invisible hand, stepped fully into the light. He stood in the center of the newly renovated lobby of the Knox Plaza, the sunlight catching the sharp silver gray of his eyes as he addressed a bank of cameras in a room full of wary investors. He wasn't wearing a midnight blue suit today. He was in a simple, charcoal blazer, his posture relaxed for the first time in his public life. He spoke not of logistics or leverage, but of accountability and transparency. He announced the dissolution of the private security subsidiaries that had acted as his shadow army, and the creation of a new, community-focused infrastructure fund. But the real shift, the one that made the grizzled veterans of the real estate world lean forward in their chairs, was the woman standing at his right hand. Seraphine Vale didn't look like a traditional chief of operations. She wore a tailored suit of deep olive, but she still kept her hair in the practical, high-swept crown that had become her signature. She didn't carry a designer handbag. She carried a tablet loaded with structural diagnostics and environmental impact reports. She had traded her maintenance wrench for the most powerful operational position in the state, yet her hazel eyes remained as steady and unblinking as they had been when she was tending the conservatory's ferns. "This company will no longer build fortresses," Seraphine told the press, her voice carrying a resonant, natural authority that required no microphone. "We are going to build ecosystems. We've spent too long engineering ways to keep people out. From now on, Knox Urban Holdings is going to engineer ways to bring the city together. If math doesn't prioritize the human element, we aren't building it." The transition was not without its friction. Julian Vane and the remnants of the old board had been purged, their desks cleared of the ledgers that recorded the syndicate's dirty secrets. In their place, Seraphine had hired a team of young engineers, urban planners, and environmentalists. People who, like her, saw the world not as a series of targets, but as a complex machine that needed careful, honest maintenance. The Don had become a CEO in more than just name. Thatcher spent his days in the public sector, negotiating with the very municipal authorities he used to bypass. But every evening, when the sun dipped below the skyline, he returned to the office at the top of the tower where Seraphine sat. He walked into her office one late Tuesday, finding her deep in the blueprints for the new Bram Knox Botanical Park, a project she had designed to be the lungs of the new waterfront. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her work with the same silent, predatory appreciation he had always felt, but now it was tempered with a profound, grounded peace. "The board is still complaining about the cost of the permeable pavement," Thatcher noted, his voice a warm hum in the quiet room. "The board can complain all they want," Seraphine replied without looking up, a faint smile touching her lips. "I showed them the long-term maintenance savings on the stormwater runoff. They can't argue with the physics, Thatcher. They just aren't used to a COO who knows how the pipes actually work." Thatcher walked over, placing a hand on her shoulder. The touch was no longer hesitant, or fraught with the fear of his own shadows. "I've officially stepped down from the chairmanship of the Security Council," he whispered. "The shadows are officially empty, Seraphine. There's nothing left but work." Seraphine leaned back, looking up at him. She saw the man who had knelt in the mud for his son, and she saw the leader who had dared to dismantle his own armor for her. "Then the empire is finally rebuilt," she said. "Not with steel and secrets, but with something that actually breathes." As they looked out at the city, they didn't see a territory to be conquered. They saw a home. The architect of the syndicate and the maintenance girl of the gardens had found a middle ground, a place where power was used to protect the vulnerable, and where the hierarchy was defined not by who was at the top, but by who was willing to get their hands dirty to keep the foundation strong. The Knox name was no longer a threat. It was a promise. And as Seraphine closed the blueprint for the day, she realized that she had finally found the one garden she never wanted to leave. Chapter 12. The morning mist clung to the ground of the Montclair Heights Conservatory, a soft white veil that smelled of damp earth and the promise of a long, warm spring. It was no longer a place of rigid lines and hidden traps. Under Seraphine's direction, the concrete barriers had been replaced with tiered bioswales, and the sterile reflecting pool had been transformed into a living wetland, teeming with dragonflies and the rhythmic chorus of frogs. The hierarchy of the old world had been buried under 6 inches of rich, organic topsoil, and in its place, something far more resilient was taking root. Bram Knox sat on a low stone wall, his sketchpad resting on his knees. He was no longer the slight, trembling boy in the oversized tuxedo. He wore a grass-stained hoodie and sturdy boots, his dark hair messy and windblown. He wasn't drawing the cold geometry of a skyscraper today. He was meticulously mapping the intricate veins of a local milkweed leaf. He looked up, his ice-blue eyes, so like his father's, but no longer filled with the vibrating terror of the wolf cub, tracking 2 figures walking along the winding gravel path. Thatcher and Seraphine moved together with a synchronicity that spoke of a shared history written in scars and survival. Thatcher had traded his tailored midnight blue suits for a rugged canvas jacket, his hands tucked into his pockets as he listened to Seraphine explain the nitrogen cycle of the new orchard. The Don, who had once controlled the city through fear, now looked at the woman beside him with a quiet, grounding devotion that required no public kneeling to prove. "The board still doesn't understand why we opened the gates to the public on weekends," Thatcher said, though there was no edge of concern in his voice. "They think we're losing our exclusive edge." Seraphine stopped by a flowering dogwood, her bronze fingers gently brushing a petal. "Exclusivity is just another word for a cage, Thatcher. You spent 20 years building walls. I think it's time you enjoyed the view from outside of them." She turned to him, the morning sun catching the deep hazel of her eyes and the silver chain around her neck. She wasn't an intern, a guest, or a ward of the state anymore. She was the co-architect of a world that didn't need a shadow to stay standing. She had taught the strategist that power wasn't a bank balance. It was the ability to protect a garden and the people who walked within it. Thatcher reached out, his hand finally closing over hers. His palm was calloused now, a sign of the hours he spent helping her clear the old maintenance tunnels and plant the new saplings. It was the hand of a man who had finally earned his peace. "I think the view is perfect," he whispered. Bram watched them from his spot on the wall, a small, secret smile touching his lips. He saw the way his father laughed, a real, hollow-free sound that echoed through the trees, and the way Seraphine leaned into him, a lioness who had found her pride. He looked back down at his sketch, adding one final detail to the garden map. Two small figures, standing together in the light. The new hierarchy was finally complete. It wasn't built on the blood of enemies, or the leverage of senators. It was built on the courage of a woman who jumped into the water when everyone else froze, and the wisdom of a man who was brave enough to follow her into the light. As the sun burned through the last of the mist, the gardener and the strategist walked deeper into their woods, leaving the shadows behind forever. If this story of strength, integrity, and the beauty of a rebuilt life resonated with you, let us know. Like this video if you believe that true power is found in the courage to do what is right. Comment below, what was your favorite moment of Seraphine's journey? Was it the dive into the pool, or her stand in the boardroom? Share this story with someone who needs to know that even the coldest worlds can be warmed by a little bit of dirt and a lot of heart. Subscribe and hit the bell to join us for more sagas of redemption and the power of the human spirit.